Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. My name is D'Angela Burns-Wallace. I am the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Studies. And this is going to be an amazing experience. I am so glad that you are all here with us. Undergraduate Studies and the Spencer Museum of Art has a strong and long partnership. We have worked over the last 6 years that we introduced the KU Common Book. And with the Spencer Museum's help, we have been able to have a common work of art as long as we have had the KU Common Book on campus. These programs work very closely in concert, and the idea is that the common work of art helps to bring a visual element each and every year that programs along with the themes of our common book. Today's speaker, Alexandra Bell, will be the fourth artist that is able to join us as part of the Common Work of Art program across the 6 years that we have been able to celebrate both the art and the books. The KU Common Work of Art program and the Visiting Artist series support the mission of both undergraduate studies and the Spencer Museum of Art. The program gives students the opportunity to intellectually engage with the themes from the book through the vision and the genius of the artists that we are able to share with them. The Common Book of the Work of Art is part of a larger commitment from Spencer Museum of Art to provide that experiential learning opportunity for our students so that they have the chance to kind of get hands-on experiences with curating pieces, understanding and having conversations with the artist, and being able to relate it to other aspects of things that they see inside and outside of the classroom. The Common Book and the Common Work of Art are part of a larger series of programming that we do throughout the year. We brought Claudia Rankine, and I know many of you were able to join us this fall and talk with her directly about Citizen, which was the Common Book for this year. But we also have the opportunity in which the Common Work of Art Falls exhibit was actually curated by Kate Meyer with the assistance of 7 undergraduate students. The exhibit featured work by Glenn Ligon and Carrie Mae Weems, who are also actually featured in Citizen. Over 900 students have been able to come through this fall to look at the KU Common Work of Art exhibit as a part of their classes. The KU Common Book was actually integrated into over 200 of our first year classes. And so students all across the curriculum were able to engage both with the book and many with the Common Work of Art exhibit. This collaboration could not happen without, first, the Spencer Museum of Art, but with so many other partners across campus. And so we want to thank those partners, many of who are in the room, but some that are not, but to say that this type of conversation, this opportunity, doesn't happen without the community supporting the conversation, the ideas, and the opportunity to really dialogue about the issues that we see and face and that play out in our society day to day. All of our partners are listed in the program, but I do want to say just a special thank you again to the Spencer Museum of Art for really taking the lead and showing us how to bring this book and the issues to life in different ways and engaging directly with our undergraduate students, giving them that hands-on opportunity to have these conversations. With that, I hope you enjoy the evening, and please engage and have questions. It will be a phenomenal conversation. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kate Meyer, a curator here at the Spencer. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to thank all the people because they're the ones that answered my email when I said, please, 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 you got to do this with us. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Alexandra Bell. So, what I want you to feel free to do is share the support for these great partners to whom you feel particular allegiance. Of course, we got to thank the Spencer Museum of Art for its good experience, the Anna Taylor Center for Women and Gender Equity, African and African American Studies, American Studies, Film and Media Studies, Visual Art, the Hall Center for the Humanities, the Crest Foundation Department of Art History, Office of Diversity and Equity, OMA, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the University Honors Program, the University of Kansas Libraries, and the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Okay, so we've been an adventure the past day and a half installing works of art here on campus, and there was a student who walked by and she said something along the lines of, "How did this happen?" And the beginning was when Claudia Rankine was here. She put us on to Alexandra Bell's work. So you have Claudia Rankine to thank for another thing. So I'm going to start by reading the information that Alexandra Bell wants you to know about her, because I'm going to let you use your own words, and then we're going to shift into mine. Alexandra Bell is a multidisciplinary artist who investigates the complexities of narrative, information consumption, and perception. Utilizing various media, she deconstructs dominant histories to highlight patterns in news reportage and society at large. Bell holds a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities from the University of Chicago and an MS in Print Journalism from Columbia University. She lives and works in Brooklyn. Here we're shifting to me. She's also the 2018 recipient of an Infinity Award in Applied Art from the International Center of Photography, which honors outstanding achievements in photography and the visual arts. So, for the past few months, I've been learning about Alexandra Bell via her Instagram, which is how I knew about that Infinity Award, because you were excited, and darn right you should have been. And it's been helping me prepare for what we were going to be doing, because she's one of those artists that shares her process through her media, which I love. But the number one thing I can tell you about Alexandra Bell from her Instagram and from the past day and a half is that she is busy. Alexandra Bell hustles. She sprints with the urgency of an artist who has found a path through which to speak truth to power, and the courage of somebody ready to take it. So let's welcome her to the Spencer Museum of Art in KU.
I think you guys could keep on, you know, that was like, you can keep on, I'm fine with that. Thank you for having me. I actually didn't know that, it's a little feedback. I didn't know that Claudia had recommended me. I have to give her a shout out. And we've had, so, you know, Claudia Rankine interviewed me over the summer after seeing, I guess, one of my works, maybe on Instagram. I don't know. I have to be careful what I put up there. It's coming back to me. And a lot of our conversations have been around whiteness. And so that's the through line for us. And I'm gonna come back to Citizen at some point later in my discussion. Are you guys hearing me okay? I hear static. Okay. All right. So there are 5 works in the counter-narrative series. You guys have 3 on site. And the follow-up to the first one, which is a triptych, the kind of most popular one, which is the one that features Michael Brown. I'm going to get to that process later, but I want to kind of walk you guys through a little bit of some clips of bias in the media. And those of you who were at dinner with me last night, just bear with me, right? Because I kind of spilled the beans early. This is a quote that I encountered in undergrad that's always stuck with me. The power of the media lies not only in their ability to reflect the dominant racial ideology, but in their capacity to define it in the first place. And so the clips that I'm going to share with you are ways the media has kind of shaped ideas and perceptions of other racial groups. I'm particularly interested in kind of minority and marginalized experience. So you'll see that pop up. This is an ad, like it's kind of think about the classifieds of a paper. This is from 1836, in a DC paper, cash for 400 Negroes. This is kind of one of the earliest ways that Black Americans appeared in kind of American print. (1941). This is from Life magazine. This is just a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor. I guess they just thought that they would really help people try to figure out the difference between Japanese and Chinese. Excuse my French, for those of you who may not be able to see, the title is How to Tell Japs from the Chinese. And the top and the bottom feature photos of each respective kind of group, and there are markings to kind of help you figure out what the differences may be. Life magazine. Yes. This is a political cartoon. I don't remember the origin. Welfare Queens. This is probably one of the most enduring stereotypes for Black women. This is coined in the 70s by Reagan. And he was referring to a Chicago woman, actually, Linda Taylor, who was a quite successful con artist. She managed to kind of bilk the welfare system to a tune of about $150,000 to $180,000 a year. Anyway, unfortunately, though, this is an enduring stereotype when, in fact, most people on welfare are white women and children. This one's one of my favorite ones to share. This is from the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. This is from the Situation Room. If you guys look in the far back corner, you'll see Audrey Thomason. She's the counterterrorism director. So she's a major role in this photo. And then we have then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the front. Where'd they go? They've been removed. An ultra-Orthodox paper in Brooklyn decided that there wasn't a good idea to feature them, so they edited them out before publishing the photograph. Hey! So one of the things is really interesting, and one of the reasons I always share this is that one of the ways that I see women crop up in media, or the way that women the media deals with women, is erasure, like literally and kind of figuratively, they're absent. And this is probably the starkest example of that. They were there, and then they weren't. I mean, this man had a whole shoulder manufactured. This is this took some guts, you know? And I'm thinking, I'm like, somewhere along the line when you're like creating his arm, you're like, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe we should just not share the photo, but that's not what happened. The New York Post is a paper I loathe, but it's a circulation of maybe 500,000, so someone's reading it, so I have to share it. This is from the shooting in San Bernardino. You can see that, Muslim killers. That black line I actually added. I think there's either a dead body or someone severely injured there. I'm not exactly sure how that made the front cover, outside of being the post, so I covered it up. I don't actually use this type of work in the counter-narrative series. It's too offensive in the first place. This would just be a retract. So there's nothing there for me to do. This was a Wall Street Journal tweet. Something's not white. They're supposedly referring to her bra strap, but come on. Now we get to the representation of whites. Clean-shaven white man arrested by police as at least 10 people are injured. Man arrested after van plows into people outside London Mosque. I think the van, it's one of those self-driving cars. We don't have it over on this side yet. And Las Vegas shooting suspect, Stephen Paddock. Now at this point, I'm imagining if you know someone's name, you know their age, you know where they live, you have a photo. And so this is very interesting to me. More than 50 people killed in Las Vegas attacks. And my friend and I say, oh, he has to be white. There's no picture. That's how we figured it out. So that gives you a sense, right, in both print media and online as well, in terms of how people are represented. one of the things that I'm very interested in and that the counter narrative speaks to is subtlety, right? And so a lot of that crops up in certain words and so certain coded language. And many of the things that you saw in the front, I guess everybody would spot. Everybody would know something's amiss, right? And so I'm really interested in capturing that. And so I want to read this to you. This is from 125 years ago, right? And so this is from a paper called Afro-American. Then the newspapers are careless in their statements of the crimes committed by Negroes. People read by headlines, so keep that in mind as we get to my work. And when they see the term black brute, they guess at the rest. The press must help in this work. And the press has failed miserably. This is from the Central Park 5 case. In 1989, on April 19th, a young woman jogging through Central Park was raped at approximately 10 p.m. I think she was in a coma for 12 days. She was severely injured. 5 Black and Latino youth were arrested, or more were arrested, but 5 were ultimately convicted of the crime, and they turned out to be innocent. But this is 2 days after that happened. They had been branded wolf pack. This is 3 days after that happened. Wilding. And so there's this kind of animalistic language that gets attached to black bodies. And Claudia Rankine talks about this in a bit when she talks about hypervisibility. This one here, a Manhattan jury convicted a hulking brute Wednesday. And then if you look at the bottom, I didn't highlight that part. They actually give his height and his weight. Almost done, this part. Woman-hating brute, 20, raped and murdered park jogger Karina. It says demon in the weeds. Now, this is before a conviction. So this is I use this before I get into counter narratives because the word demon has a significance when we talk about Darren Wilson and Michael Brown. Michael Brown referred to, Darren Wilson referred to Michael Brown as a demon and a hulk in his grand jury testimony, for which he was kind of not convicted. And so when I get to this, the counter narratives, we start here. Now, I want to explain how I came up with this project. So I started Columbia grad school in 2011. I was at the time, there was a print segment. You could, go on a track. You could be a, just beat journalist, or you could be an anchor, and you could tell us apart. The print beat people, we look beat. We came to work in our pajamas, and the anchors were 7 coats of makeup on, and they all had those voices. And like most, universities and some, I guess Ivy League, so the class is pretty racially imbalanced. And maybe one of two blacks in this particular class. And so as part of the course, one of the things that we had to do is we were assigned to read 3 papers a day: the New York Times, the Daily News, and the Wall Street Journal. And so some of my obsessiveness just kind of comes from that, and some of it is just I'm a little neurotic. But at the time, we were kind of learning, the point of this exercise is to try to see how are papers tackling the same topic, right? So how might the New York Times, which is a paper that kind of writes, is kind of slower, it's not a breaking news type paper, how would that compete with maybe the Daily News, which is about 75 cents? The New York Times is about $2.50 a day. When you get to Sunday, it's $6. So you've spent quite a bit. And so at the time, there was something off to me that I couldn't point whenever we would look at a story. Whenever, especially we looked at something that was about race or about land, all the rules were being followed. Everybody was being interviewed, but something was off for me. So we get to 2016, and one of the ways that this kind of idea pops into my head is, unfortunately, there have been a number of police shootings of unarmed black people. And my friends and I started this unfortunate kind of, I guess this thing we would do where we meet at a bar every time one happened. I mean, at this point, we're alcoholics, right? That's kind of unfortunate, but this is what's happening. And so we're in the summer of 2016, and there's Alton Sterling had been shot. And my friends and I were at the corner of this particular bar, and it's 2 a.m. when it's closing, and we're about to get into cabs to go home when the Facebook Live feed for Philando Castile comes on. Have no idea what I'm looking at. Close it. We go to sleep, wake up, there are hashtags in my phone, right? And then probably some weeks later, there's Corinne Gaines. It's a young woman from Baltimore, Maryland. The police, the SWAT team, sorry, I should be very clear, SWAT team came to her house to serve unpaid kind of parking tickets. And she barricaded herself in the home with her kid, and she had a weapon. And at the end result, she was in a standoff with the officers for maybe 6 hours. Her son was shot. They engaged. She ultimately was killed. And so what we would do when we would get to drink is we would argue about what happened. You know, Alton Sterling, a friend of mine, was kind of incredibly freaked out because she accidentally watched one of these videos. So we were talking a lot about the consumption of Black death via the news. By the time we get to Corinne Gaines, we're arguing about guilt. So everyone wants to know, is she at fault? She had a weapon. She shouldn't have had a weapon. The cops were there. She should go peacefully, which is kind of an odd thing to tell Black people when the cops come up. Like, you know, what exactly does that mean? But at that time, I could figure out what the issue was. And I was saying, nobody's saying she's in her home. This is very important to me. This is missing from a lot of the news titles. And so I started manipulating them. So what would it mean is instead of a young woman cradling her child and a gun, you actually just say she's in her own home. To me, it changed the tenor of the event. And so I started at that point, I said, I know exactly what article I'm going to do this on. And I don't know how far back on my Instagram you went, but the beginning of this project is there. I didn't really know what it was at first, but it was August maybe of 2016. I started playing around with this document. So at the time, you all familiar with the Michael Brown case? Okay, because I don't want to have to, I've explained all those stories, we'll be here forever. But a brief synopsis, you know, August 9th, 2014, Officer Darren Wilson, shot Michael Brown approximately 6 times. His body was left in the street for 4 hours, at least. The New York Times, on the 25th, that's the article we're looking at, so I want you to look at the bottom part. I have no idea how this wine thing ended up at the top. I was like, I'm not going to mess with that, but I'm going to let you guys do your layout. I'm assuming that's maybe breaking news, so we'll put the wine bottles up here, and we'll put the kind of murder thing down at the bottom. But a portion of this appears above the folds of the paper. So I'm just kind of think literally about what a paper looks like when it's closed. And at the bottom it says, 2 lives at the crossroads in Ferguson. And this is kind of known as the No Angel article. The author referred to Michael Brown as No Angel. And the Times got a lot of feedback about that. And so on Instagram and now here, I was marking this up. I said, you know, it's really odd. Can you guys see that red dot? It's really odd to me that an article about a kid, Michael Brown, 18, and a police officer would say 2 lives at crossroads in Ferguson. To me, it just sounds like they're neighbors, or they're maybe friends, or maybe they're just kind of on the same level, right? And so one of the reasons I pulled this article is that I thought this is kind of a false equivalency. And so I don't necessarily think the Times was trying to be objective and got in trouble, but this is what happens when you take objectivity and you run with it. These 2 people aren't equal. And while some of this may deal with the layout of the paper, right, each of these articles has to be 38 lines, that kind of comparison is dangerous. So I started here with the title markdowns. I took out the 2 lives at Crossroads in Ferguson. I took out Low. And so now it reads, Crossroads in Ferguson, a profile officer, a teenager with promise. And so it's kind of the first iteration. But I was like a long ways from finished here, right? So this is the first counter narrative. I'm giving you guys studio shots now. This is, imagine me kind of in the middle of the night hovering over like a year's worth of New York Times. Don't get on my bad side, right? Obviously. So I'm sharing this with you because at the time I didn't have an idea of what a counter narrative is. And this will be very important for you to know as you encounter the work on the street. there's always two panels. And so what we have here is really just an original article, and I'm trying to figure out what language to highlight and what I'm thinking. So when I said I was in grad school and I couldn't really touch on what was bothering me and what was confusing, I was like, why don't I just do that in front of people, right? Maybe I'll find my way to something if I'm just marking around. I'll figure it out. And so you said, Kate, I share a lot about my process, but my process is my art, right? And so a lot of what I do with the series is I'm thinking through a series of things and articles, and I'm letting people watch that. I want people to see that. I want that to ignite a particular type of thinking in terms of how you read, because this is how I read, right? And so it must take me forever to get through a paper, right? So, I'm questioning certain things. Hey, there's a very blurry picture of Darren Wilson, in part because that's a still from a video. But why are they using this similar, kind of bad photo from Michael Brown? So I was trying to toy with that, and it wasn't working out for me. I said, remove photo. By the time I got here, I was like, put the photo back. And then I came to the one on the right. Just that I wanted to strip it down to its kind of bare bones. And this one's on campus, so you'll be able to see this one. But one of the things that I highlight in that one is that first kind of column on the Darren Wilson side, all the way down to his tie, is actually not about Mike Brown. It's about a black man that he arrested in 2013. So I was like, this is just kind of too much information for me right now. So I ultimately decided to kind of redact everything to leave a very central point. But anyway, here's my process. It took me probably 13 iterations to get to this version. And what it says on the left is, a profile officer, Darren Wilson, fatally shot an unarmed black teenager named Michael Brown. It's kind of period. A teenager with promise, Michael Brown Jr., his shooting death by Darren Wilson, a white police officer. That's what I left. To me, that's all that kind of mattered in this situation. I didn't need to know how many feet away. I didn't need to know that he smoked marijuana, which I'm like, who didn't do that when they were 18? And I replaced it with this graduation photo. And I want to talk a bit about this choice, because this choice has kind of caused some problems. For both, black people don't like that I use this photo either. I think that, and that's more about respectability, right? This kind of idea or this belief that I was saying, he graduated from high school, so he shouldn't be dead. And the argument actually that I was making is that I think people have a very hard time thinking of black children, as kids. And so I wanted to choose an image that was loaded and nostalgic, and something that when you looked at it, and maybe even on another edition of this saw all those things about drug use and rapping, that you kind of go, but that's kind of what you do when you graduate. That's like the most reckless time ever. You're kind of stepping out, right? And so that's the purpose of this. And so in December 31st of 2016, actually, I got this idea that I would wheat paste these onto the street. I was like, I'll just reprint the newspaper. I had no respect for the New York Times. I'm like, I'm just gonna reprint their shit. And then I was like, that might confuse people. So I decided to put them, and this one's very large. This one's 8 feet. Each of these panels 8 feet by 6 feet wide. And there are 3 of them on the side of the library. So you have you have this version. But I decided, hey, I'm gonna print this. I'm gonna put it on the street. I have no idea if anybody will understand what I'm talking about. And this is after Trump. So everybody was like, Trump. And I almost didn't do it because I said, hey, should I be talking about this person? Or should I be looking at something from 2014? What's the relevance there? And so for me, I'm really interested in slowing down the news cycle. I think as readers, we kind of have the power to look back at events and think of how they've shaped us and really question the dominant narrative, right? And so the kind of dominant narrative is that there was this thug who was wrestling with this cop and he got killed, and so what, right? So I decided, I printed out a ton of copies, and there was a typo in my first copy, don't tell anybody. And I rented a car, and it was like 22 degrees. So everybody who's like, "Oh, it's so cold," I'm like, "Just stop talking. I'm fine." It was definitely below freezing, and we drove around some areas in Brooklyn, and I pasted them up with the clunkiest wheat paste mix ever. I don't think anything really lasted like more than like 4 days. And so that is what that looked like. There's actually a smaller one here. And you can imagine, I mean, I work full time, but I was doing this and I had gotten myself a studio and then I went broke. I was like, my credit card said stop. And so after probably the first few runs, I said, hey, I'll quit. But someone walked past the work. A man walked past the work in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and he's got in touch with me via Instagram. There was this little search for me. It was kind of cute because it's anonymous. Nobody knows I'm putting it up. This is completely illegal to do. And he said, hey, you know, I'm really inspired by this. I want to pay for you to print. I'll print it. I have a print shop. I'll print it for free. And I'm like, really? So he prints it for me. He prints it a little smaller, which was great because I had it massive. It was like 4 feet by 3. I'm 5'4", so you know, I'm in the street trying to put these up. And I put them up. And there's this amazing reaction to it, which nobody kind of knows it's me, but people know that I've been working on it. So sometimes people will tag me. They'll see a photo. They'll, tag me. And ever so often I would do a search. But I'm sharing this one with you because I started this as a journalism project. This is me really thinking about journalism. And I think Claudia said this to me. She says it's an elegy. You know, it's a memorial. It kind of became that. And so look at that wall. This wall is a mess, right? And so at some point, I'm like, they don't have to clean this shit up. Somebody have to clean the wall. And someone covered it with like a party invitation. And this is maybe a month or so in. I don't have the timeline right. I put a work up in the middle of the night. I go home. I forget exactly where it is. But my phone has like a running list of street corners in it. My friend's like, why do you have all these street corners? And I just kind of leave it like that for a second. Let her sort through that. But this is one of the ways that I started to realize how important the work had become for people. Because when this happened, I woke up and there's like all these comments in my phone and someone's cursing, don't come to our neighborhood and mess with Alex's work. And now imagine, you guys know what this is like. You put something sticky on a sheet of paper. Now tear it off. What's coming with it? What's underneath, right? I don't know how this person did that. I'm imagining someone sitting there breathing on it, like trying to peel it away. And so this is one of those moments where I was like, wow, people are really defending this work. And so at some point, this wall is ordered to be painted. And I'm like, well, that's the end of that. Like, look at all of that. That's got to go. It's even for certain areas of Brooklyn, this is kind of ridiculous. But the person who painted it was like, fuck that. I'm not painting over that. And so there's so many instances of this. I don't have other clips here, but there's so many moments where there's a print up and someone paints it, but they leave his eyes visible. So there's this kind of very interesting thing happening where people are really kind of grappling with us. I saw a guy kiss the print in the subway. So by now I'm feeling bold. I'm like, so you saw I covered up some graffiti, right? So I get this letter, this note in Instagram. Instagram's like, and this guy says, you covered up my tag. And I was like, shit, I'm sorry? He was like, I mean, I know it's Mike Brown and all, but like, you don't cover people's art. That's like street art 101. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't really know what it said. And so I said to him, maybe you should come out and paste with me so I won't do it anymore. Now, this guy could have been a serial killer. But he shows up, and there's this, like, black dude. He's, like, 40s, dreadlocks, and he's like, I'll help you. So he comes out with me at night all the time at, like, 3 in the morning. So we go to the subways. We decide, we're going to go down to the subways. We're going to stick these up. So I had the printer guy say, hey, can you give me some with adhesives so I can hang them like ads? And so we put them in the subways, and the trains are terrible, so people can hover or whatever. And so one day I go down to see, and that's where I see this man kiss the print. And so that's the reaction to this. Now, meanwhile, I'm like, I get it, it's Michael Brown, but do you see what's wrong with the journalism, right? I'm like slowly freaking out. I don't think people understand this is about journalism, not really just about misrepresentation. And I get it, it's Mike Brown, but what about the journalism? So I get to the second one, and I'm like, okay, I think I can get people to understand what I'm doing with the second one. So we get to this. Now, I know the top photo is really hard to look, not to, can stare dead at it, but I need you guys to look at the bottom part of the paper below the fold, because that's what I'm looking at. And so, just to put it up there for you, if you can read that top line. Accused of fabricating robbery, swimmers fuel tension in Brazil. And I was like, that's not a swimmer. That doesn't look like a swimmer, that's a black dude. That's Usain Bolt. Actually, that's not even breaking news. I knew he was going to win. Why is he on there? So, one of the things that I do, now this is the paper. This is my version, and this is probably will say something about my personality as well. I redid this in InDesign. So I try to copy it. I just try to copy what I think their layout is. Like I just retype it out and I replace the photos. Their vector, the top part, the New York Times, you can take that offline. So I grabbed the logo and I found like an approximate font. And so this is one of those. This is my square version. And so then I decided, I'm just going to mark it up. You guys don't have this one. Accused of fabricating robbery, swimmers fuel tension in Brazil. And so the first counter narrative I share with you just had tons of redactions. Like I'm just scratching things out, right? I like to say that I'm just really bossy. Like by the time you finish reading something that I've written on, you're just like, what the hell, man? And so WC is all over, like that means word choice. Most of you guys know that. Even at the bottom, they said Ryan Lochte, he came under siege. And I was like, that's dramatic. Come on, that's a dramatic word choice. And then they say, he had fabricated. I'm like, nah, he lied. Let's just be clear. And so I get to, and so counter narratives, the first counter narrative, which is it's not the counter narrative, but it's the original article. When you encounter it outside, it'll be the one on your left. And you'll know because it'll be the least sensible of the two. It includes commentary. So they're just marginals and marginalia. It includes instructions. So that's another thing that the first one on the left gives you a sense of maybe what I'll do on the right when I redo it. And so at the top, I say change title, remove photo, redo caption, replace with picture of swimmers. That's the redo. Rio gas station footage revealed white American swimmers were offenders. At the bottom, it says CCTV footage taken from a Shell gas station outside Olympic Park proves Ryan Lochte above robberies claimed to be false. Just one thing I just want you to know. That Olympics in the, I'm just covering my bases here. That Olympics in the Rio bottom there that's spelled without the L, that's the New York Times. I didn't do that. They had a typo. I copied their typo. Just want to be clear. But this isn't it's not a grammar exercise. I don't nitpick about errors. I mean, I have typos all the time, but I just want to be clear that my project's kind of solid. That's not me. And so I'm still doing the heavy line redaction thing here. But at the bottom, I want to leave what I think is just a point of this all. Privilege in a society where many Brazilians themselves often lament their exposure to alarming levels of violent crime and police corruption. That's it. We don't need to... The rest of that is kind of okay, but that's the point of what occurred here. And what's interesting about Ryan Lochte, besides the fact that they referred to him as a kid, is that this is like the most sophisticated lie to me. Like we know about Brazil and police corruption. I'm like, how did he pull that one out? This isn't like just a random lie. This is like a totally believable thing for anybody who's seen like City of God or you're just like, oh, this totally probably happened. And so that's something that I really wanted to this is a lot of people's favorites. It's a really dramatic one. And also people feel like I caught the times, like I caught them, like, yo, you caught them, you got them. And that is what this looks like on the street. It's about, across, it's about 15 feet and probably 6.5 feet high. And so a big part of what I'm hoping will happen and what I think happens is that these prints on the street, these really large ones, you can walk up to them and they invite kind of like a communal interrogation, and people are talking about these issues and kind of grappling with things and thinking through some of the decisions. And sometimes people write me about the things that I say and that I circle. I'm really curious about my politics around these particular things. And so this is one of the really important aspects of the work. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to, while I still do the 2 by 3 feet or 3 feet by 2 feet or whatever it may be, I wrote these people right when I was working on the Michael Brown and said, hey, can I use your wall? I just want to hang. And they said, oh, we sent you an Instagram note a month ago. This is why Instagram is good and it's dangerous, because I never got this note, but they wanted me to use the wall. So now this is like my home base. I go there and I put the work up and I take it down. And so I'm going to move to number 3. All right. Still in the New York Times, and this is August 2016. The last article was August 2016. I had a long commute, if that helps you guys. I work as a communications manager, so I'm obsessed with messaging at a public health organization. At the time, I worked at Columbia Medical School, and so I was about 90 minutes away from my Brooklyn apartment on a good day. And so I read the paper, and I came across this article, and I was like, this is the oddest title to me. Tulsa man accused of harassing Lebanese family is charged with murder. Now the first line says he called the family dirty Arabs. And I'm like, that's racism, right? Should we say racism and maybe not harassing? I don't know. I'm trying to grapple with why that's missing. But the pull quote's also a little odd to me. A suspect is said to have hit the victim's mother with a car. And I'm like, is it him? Or is it like another suspect? I don't know. But to give you guys some backstory, this man, Vernon Majors, moved next door to a family, the Jabaras. They had been living in Tulsa for since 83. I was born in 80, for 35 years. He had hit the mom with a car. He had a restraining order out against him. And I think on the particular day that he drove over the mother, he went to jail. They found him like hiding behind a tree or something. He went but they let him out. And that one thing was bad. How did he get out on bail? I'm lost. And he went back to his home next door, but he went to the family's home and he shot and killed the son on the front porch. And so a lot of my conversation with this is like, how did this happen? But I was really also wondering, how is a man who's lived in a city for 7 years, Tulsa man, and a man who's lived there for 35 not? And in the text, they also refer to him as Oklahoma man. And I'm like, what is with this label? Like, I mean, do you want to just call him a white man? Because this is a hate crime, right? And so I feel like if we're talking about hate crimes in particular, we can racialize the subject, the person who did the crime, right? Because maybe that's a motivator, I think. And so this one was difficult for me in a sense because there wasn't a ton to change. And so the other works have these really dramatic reveals. And so I get to this one and I'm a little intimidated because I'm like, well, the audience might be like, is that all she's going to change is a headline? But if you think back to the clip that I shared with you before, we read by headline. And so this one for me is incredibly important. And it's also important for me because a lot of these things are happening pre-Trump. And so I'm really interested in, so people say, oh, how did we get here? How did we get to Trump? And like, this is how we got there. There's a subtle kind of othering to me of the victim. And no one got this title right? I want to, before I get to kind of my work on it, I want to share Lebanon news. Oklahoma man shoots dead filthy Lebanese neighbor. I was like, okay. The Washington Post. The racism word is just hard to use. Man's unusual fixation with Lebanese neighbors led to killing, Tulsa police say. And I also think that when papers quote people, it's a cop-out. In the title, when you quote people in the title, it's a cop-out. This is kind of literally a cop-out, sorry. So I worked on it. There's a slide in here that I didn't share, and I'm going to talk about it because a student asked me this. I don't know if she was Lebanese, but she was very curious about my decision to remove Lebanese family. Anyway, I said change. I changed Tulsa man. I think at the bottom it says Oklahoma man around where I first circle and where that green kind of sticky goes to. And the question is kind of like, the victim was an Oklahoma man as well, no? And then on the side it says white American. And so I want to talk a bit about why I use white American, right? And Claudia and I had some back and forth about this. Not bad. We just had a really good conversation about it. There's a dissertation that I read. It's a reporting in black and white. It's about Emmett Till. You know what I'm talking about? I've read it like 5 times. It's by this guy named Craig Flournoy. And what he does is he compares the reporting from Montgomery bus boycott and Emmett Till in the New York Times to like a local black paper, the Birmingham World. And so in it, it's just chock full of information and stats. One of the things that he shares is that during the 30s, I think, there was a study that was trying to see how frequently papers gave the race of the perpetrator in the headline when a crime was committed. And so he studied a particular paper for 30 days, and he found that there were like 35 or 36 instances of blacks committing crimes and in court. And of the 36 times, and 34 of those times, Negro or Negroes was in the headline. And then he found that there were 131 instances of whites committing crimes or in court. How many times in the headline? 0. And I was like, wow, okay, I'm not really shocked by this, but damn. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is the invisibility of whiteness, right? It's so, and I think this is also, not to make Trump central to this work, but if you also think about his platform, if you can call whatever he was doing when he was running for president, he was always naming races. Always. I don't think I ever heard him say white American, right? So I'm really interested in that. I'm also interested in this idea that whiteness doesn't necessarily denote nation and American. And so I removed Lebanese, and I grappled with that because I was, is this a form of erasure? But I removed it because I felt like it was used in a derogatory and coded way. I felt like when I first read this, I was like, well, are they trying to say that maybe they were terrorists or something? Like at that point, it just felt tainted, so I took it out. After years of racism toward neighbors, white American man charged with murder. Now, you can fight me on a grammar, but that's not the point. And I pulled the quote. I said, he called the family dirty Arabs. And this article itself is excellent. If I were a journalism student, this would be exactly what I was told to do. There's a micro, there's a macro. All the bases are covered, but the headline frames it in a way that I approach it differently. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do in counter narratives is like set the stage so there's a particular type of consistency. And I think this is really important for me to say that because there is a work that I have questions about. It's my own. And that's the Venus Williams work, which is up as well. We just finished that before I walked in here. So that's counter narrative number 3. This one's massive. This is 20 feet across and 5 feet high. Same building. All right. Sports Saturday. This is McEnroe. 58 and still fussing. So McEnroe, I think he had a book coming out. And so that's why he was here. And I want to point to Federer, because I think this is important, that in some ways he got similar placement to Venus Williams. And so Venus Williams won her semifinal on a Thursday. And so she was featured in the Friday paper. So this is kind of where I'm messing with the timing of the New York Times. And the sports editor at the New York Times was pissed at me for this. And I heard about it. I heard it was unfair, which I'll address in a bit. I think I had cut it out. So I'm also just, when I'm on the train, sometimes I'm just like, where's my scissors? And so I cut it out, so I don't have the full one here. But I believe the other portion of the paper, the top half of the paper, was about soccer balls. Now, I'm trying to figure out how Venus Williams, at 37, is pretty much set a record on kind of the oldest woman in the final since Navratilova in 94. And this is kind of the placement. She's in the inside in black and white next to the scoreboard. And so if we think about kind of the invisibility and value, I wanted her to have the same placement as John McEnroe. And so that's the change that I made. Now, I do want to talk about what I think is misleading about this work a bit. She was the day before, and so I think my question is kind of, why is John McEnroe here when Venus Williams played that day? I think in some ways I need to ask another question. I haven't asked it yet. But when you encounter this, I want you to keep this in mind. Because it's not that she was in the same paper in the back or behind him. She was just in the paper the day before with what I thought was a diminished kind of representation. And I get it, Federer had a similar layout, but she was killing it. She had a record. And if we think about sports and gender equality, that was the point. That's the point behind this work. People are so attached to, they hate McEnroe so much when I try to explain that I think this is maybe a little error on my part. They're like, we don't care, it's art. But all of the works are defendable. Like I can defend all of the decisions. They all make sense. They all follow the rules and the tenets of journalism. And in areas where I've sometimes erred, I've changed the work in public. With the second one, I had previously said that the swimmers were aggressors, and I thought that was unfair. So I went down one day with a little patch, and I covered it up with offenders. I was like, that's a better word, with a little asterisk, and I left a public explanation. So I try to treat it the same way I think papers should treat mistakes. So that's the fourth one, and then we're coming up on the last one, and that's kind of in public for scale. Is that a tennis ball in her head? No, I'm just this is on the side of the cafe. So we're gonna come to this one. And this is probably one of the hardest layouts. Before we go there, I wanna kind of jump way back, and this is maybe feel a little odd. People say to me, oh, your work, why doesn't your work outside of Venus Williams? Now, mind you, I've only done 5 or 6 of these things. So when people say, why haven't you done something? I'm like, what? I mean, I only have 6 things. Like, but one of the things that I think is really important, and I want to get to the kind of idea of erasure, because people say, hey, are you finding any more things about Black women? And I'm like, no, they're not in the paper. Like, they're really not in the paper. And so I shared with you guys earlier the clips from the Central Park 5, right? This will give a sense of how the paper can assign value. And that when you read, it's just as important for you to think about what's there, but to think about what isn't there. You have to think about what's missing and what's omitted, right? And so I'm working on this project. It's not a public project, but it's about the Central Park 5. And so I'm in the library for a month or so, and I'm reading microfilm, and I hate looking at microfilm. And I remember thinking this was kind of sexy when Julia Roberts was doing it. I was like, yeah, this looks really good in the movies. When you're in the theater, when you're there and you're looking through these, like, and scrolling through everything and trying to read, it's the worst. And reading New York papers in like the 80s and like the crap epidemic, it was like dead baby, rape. It was really just, it was a challenge. But what was really difficult about it as well, and I'm looking at 2 weeks of coverage, so about 40 pages that start with kind of the first day of the rape up until we get to Trump's infamous kind of ad, the bring back the police, bring back the death penalty ad. And one of the things that's really striking about it, besides the fact that the Daily News had published these young kids, so they were between 13 and 17, they published their home addresses. They published their school addresses. They put their faces in the paper. They put them on the front page. But one of the things that's really important about it as well is that the Central Park jogger was 28 white woman investment banker. I think of that week, she was probably one of 24 women raped, unfortunately. But she was in New York. Of that, I think she was just 2. There were 2 white women raped. There was the rest of the women were women of color, and there was a Black woman raped in Brooklyn and thrown off a 50-foot rooftop. And I think she sustained serious injuries, but I think she landed maybe on her feet or something. All her bones were shattered. And you just can't find any mention of it in the paper. There's no mention of it. It's just completely missing. And another thing that I encountered, so I'm at April 30th, and I come across a sketch of a rapist. Some Latino man had been raping and sodomizing 15-year-old girls in East Harlem, primarily Latino victims. And it was on page 26. It's the first sketch. It's on page 26 in the bottom of the paper. And I was like, that's odd. So I get to May 1st. On the third page, there's an article about the jogger, and it says, jogger blinks 3 times. So on page 3. So it's a lot of that is kind of what I'm trying to grapple with when I'm looking at these things. I'm kind of wondering. So I approached that in some ways with this, and it was about visibility. It wasn't about paying McEnroe back for his comments about the sisters. It was really about what does equality look like? And how can I render that in some of these examples, right? And so it's kind of like way off a tangent, but it's really important to what I bring to some of these. And that's a central question I get. You can't get rid of this work. It has a black woman. So we move to the final one, which you guys have. And this one's on the art building. It's in the art building. It's one of the smaller works. It's each of the panels 6 feet squared. This is about the White Nationalist March in Charlottesville. I was like, oh man, by now people send me articles, right? I open up my Instagram and people are like, did you see this? Did you see this? What changed this? And a lot of times people just want me to change shit they don't like. They're like, this is I don't like this. I don't like this at all. And I'm like, well, but what's wrong with it? It just rubs me the wrong way. And I'm like, okay. And so you can imagine this day, and I already had the paper. I was like waiting. I was like, oh, they're going to get this wrong. They're going to get this wrong because it's not a Black Lives Matter march, because that shit would be from the top to the bottom. Oh, they didn't get it wrong. And they did. This is on the right-hand side. This is the article. It's a side note. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, there was a torch rally, there was a death. I don't understand why these people are in the middle of the paper. And so this is a very simple change. This is very much about layout and space. And so I marked it up. And it's very simple. It's a very simple markup. What you will notice on this work, though, when you see it in person, is that I have a lot of questions about words. And so I don't change everything, though. I sometimes mark things just because I don't really know what's bothering me, but I'm curious about them. And so, there's a word that's like racial skirmishes. I'm like, what the hell is a racial skirmish? Like, if somebody called me the N-word and hit me with like a broom or something, I don't know if that's a skirmish. Like, that just feels like really violent to me. And then I do understand, like, I'm like, car plows. I'm like, that's a little maybe rammed. I don't know. So there's just certain things that I circled that I didn't change. But what I did know is that this particular photo should have been in the middle. Now, I visited Pomona College just before I got here, and the Black Student Union voted against my work being on campus. And I think people thought I was going to be really shocked, but they were like, some of the black kids were like, no. But there's a black man that's been hit by the car. And so there was this argument that my work kind of, I guess, exploited black pain, which, I mean, I maybe would think that somebody might make that argument about using Michael Brown. But I was really shocked about that one here. And I don't think that's why the New York Times gave it this placement. So that's the fix. And I didn't change white nationalists to white supremacists. I didn't say terrorists. I agree with the difference between using white nationalism and white supremacists, so I side with the paper here. But this is one of the really interesting things about engaging with the public, is that they expect a lot of my changes to really go against the paper. But I'm also trained in journalism, so I understand some of the reasons behind the decisions that are made, and so I try to adhere to those, and I try not to use my work to kind of make random points that I don't think have any place in reportage. And so it's a key guiding point for me. And so that's where we leave off. That's the final work. You guys have this at the art center? Chalmers Hall. That's number 5. And since we talked about my Instagram so much, there you go. I think it's really important for us, and look at the series, to think about the language and think about the words and the terminology and the changes that I make and consider them. And when you read, and I guess this is something that I tell students, so this particular work here, I work with students on this a lot. And one of the things, and it's the best one because everybody can have their counter narrative, right? So I did this quick teaching gig at Bennington, and I had a class of 14 students. And I use this work in part because there's so much footage and there's so much that there was a chance for students to create their own and nobody to have really any overlap. And everybody did their work, and then we talked about it at the end, and some students were like, I don't think mine's fair. So it has this really, it had a certain kind of like impact, and most students grapple with the language. Some people were like, white supremacist kills lady in car and keeps driving. Like, some of the titles were really crazy. But it's a good exercise, and so I recommend for people when you open the paper and when you read to really kind of think critically about some of the language and the terminology that you come across, to think about how minorities are situated, to think about what may not be there, to ask yourselves questions that are put before you, and that's really kind of central to counter narratives. That's it. I think I'm doing okay on time. All right. And so. Q&A? Yeah. Okay. I'm down. This is my favorite part.
So you talked about how when you put these in, people sometimes go and make alterations.
Yes.
Other people engage with the work in a similar way. Like you go back and revisit these and see notes of somebody.
I saw a FU once on, I mean, for the most part, they leave them alone. Michael Brown's been defaced a couple of times. I've seen Thug and Drug Dealer added, but someone went back the next day and deleted it. Somebody wrote the N-word on his face. So this is around the time that, so as I'm going, I'm kind of creating rules for myself, right? I put one up near my studio at the time, was in Bushwick. And so I would walk past it every time I got off the train. And so one day it said, yeah, it had the N-word. And it was spelled with one G, and I felt like writing back, he's from St. Louis. But I think I crossed something out at a point, and like right in the middle of it, I was like, actually, I'm not in this anymore. I'm just gonna let it do what it do. So that was like the last time I actually touched the work. And for the most part, people leave them alone. People don't. When I put them in the train station, I mean, the Michael Brown elicits the most interaction. I'm just like, well, it's funny because part of me is like, I obviously have a problem like leaving a blank page, but when I'm like looking at the street, I'm like, wow, that really pissed you off, you wrote on it. Like, and it's kind of this funny thing, right? I'm just like, why are you writing on it? But someone had written like, this is liberal bullshit on it, and I was like, yeah, maybe. I mean, are you talking about the whole paper? Because that's kind of what I'm saying about the Times. I think this is kind of what liberal bullshit looks like, right? It's just like racism light. But yeah, people write on them. People write on them, but not a lot. And I think the Michael Brown is the one, for the most part, that's gotten the most commentary. But you also see these kind of amazing examples of people protecting it too, which is really interesting. So. Yeah.
So I wonder if I used to buy Hyde Park for you.
Well, I'm from Chicago.
Yeah, I figured that. And what did you learn from Chicago that there's sometimes
The Defender. So I read The Defender too as a kid.
Well, in my generation, it was the Daily News.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Hyde Park's interesting. University of Chicago's interesting, right? I'm from Chicago. I live like probably 5-10 minutes away from the Nation of Islam headquarters. Uh-huh. We might be. And then you go and it's like all white. And I'm like, oh man, Get Out could have came out, like it could have come out then. It's a very interesting space. Chicago's like this chocolate city, and then you go and there's this really different type of space. But I was like several majors, which is how I ended up with I was like, how can I turn this into a degree? And they were like, oh, just combine all of that and call it humanities. And I was like, yes. So I actually was a media studies major at the beginning, and I was like, I knew what I was doing from the beginning. I was media studies. I was film and creative writing for a second, and then I tried to transfer to NYU, and they were like, oh, can you give us $30,000? And I was like, hell no. And I was like, you do know I'm coming from the University of Chicago, right? Let's be clear. But University of Chicago was paying a bit more. Columbia slammed me. It's a wrap for me now, loan-wise. But when I decided, I wasn't going to transfer, it was decided for me, but I switched to political science. And so then I was like, I worked at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and so I guess all of this just kind of collided. And then I kind of knew I wanted to be an artist at some point, but I was like, you already did humanities, so you're just going to pick every broke career, right? I was like, just do something. Then I was like, yeah, journalism, that sounds about right. It's like, so yeah, I think in some ways, I've just always been a bit critical. And my mom used to have these little random pop quizzes that would be like really disconcerting. I mean, be in the car, and she'd be like, why is the car in front of us? Why are those lights redder than that one? And I was like, I don't know, they're light. She was like, it's moving, and that one's not. And I'm like, but okay, got it. She was like, stay on it. So I'm always looking at something and kind of asking questions. And so I think it's kind of key. And I also think when you go to a place like University of Chicago, so I was there in 2000, I graduated in 2005. I was there in 2001, I was a freshman, and the classes, they're small there. Freshman class maybe 1,000, black population is like 22. I think when you're in spaces like that, you become really clear about the language that's being attached and applied to you. And that's part of what I started to kind of ask, like, what are the words? And, Claudia Rankine has a passage in here, actually, let me see if I can kind of find it, that is very much about hypervisibility. Words work as release, well-oiled doors opening, closing between intention and gesture, a pulse in a neck, the shiftiness of the hands, an unconscious blink. The conversations you have with your eyes translate everything and nothing. What will be needed, what goes unfelt, unsaid, what has been duplicated, redacted here, redacted there, altered to hide or disguise, words encoding the bodies they cover, and despite everything, the body remains. Occasionally, it is interesting to think about the outburst if you would just cry out. To know what you'll sound like is worth noting. And something about that is just like, damn, that was like my college experience. I think when you're somewhere and you're the other, right? There's a different vantage point. So I'm really interested in that vantage point. I'm really interested. So I'm reading the paper. I'm like, I'm a gay black woman. So when I look at the paper, I look for certain things. When I look at the paper, I'm like, hey, why aren't they talking about black missing girls, or why aren't there any stories about trans murders? Like that's how I approach the paper, and so that gives me I have a different viewpoint, and that's part of what I'm trying to force on the people when I'm shifting things, and that's as much about University of Chicago as just walking in the world, I think. Yes.
And also the gesture of interaction.
Yes. Oh God, I hate online. So I put this there, and I don't know how I should, but I'm part of at the time Columbia had a print and an anchor split, and then when we were in school paying $100,000, they were like, print's dead, and I was like, no, it's not. There's something I know what it is, and I'm always really I always try to be really PC about it. I think that white folks are buying a $6 paper on a Sunday. So I'm really curious, it's what is the time trying to pull off and tell this audience that's not online, right? And so, or $2.50, and so I think online media works similarly. I'm not as invested in it, so I can't talk about it that much, but you have above the scroll, what information do you need to look for? It changes throughout the day, right? So I went to the Times to talk to them because they wouldn't stop bothering me. No. So I go to the Times and I text my friends and I'm like, I'm in the lobby. Selfie. If I'm not available in an hour, call the cops. So I'm like, I'm on counter narrative number 4, and I kind of feel like this isn't funny anymore, right? I'm like, I was in the New Yorker. They're pissed now. And so I think a big part of that is that, and when I was there, I asked the editor, because I had seen something online, and we were complaining about it on my Facebook page. We were like typing and writing about it. And then the girl wrote, because I said, please explain to me why this description is there. It was about a shooting in Florida, like after Pulse, but it was like a black club. And there was like a whole paragraph that described this girl's meal. And it was like she had like a sweet tea and chicken wings and greens. And I was pissed. I was like, this is like the most racialized. Like, what does this have to do with the shooting? Like, I felt like they were trying to give me a picture of the victim, but in this really negative way. Like, oh, just so you know. And I'm like, if you just want to say they're black people, you could just say they're black people. Don't attach all these things. And so it was gone. No, I had cut and pasted it and put it in and said, why is this here? And one of my J-school friends says, I don't know, let me go look. I need to read it in context. And she says, oh, shit, somebody must have felt like it was gone. It's missing. Someone must have thought it was a bad idea because they took it out. But the Times doesn't record those changes. They record like maybe a name misspelling or something, but there's so many other changes that happen. I'm interested in, like, what did you feel bold enough to print? Like, because the paper comes out the day after this news article online. So what exactly did you feel like, we'll print this, and I'm going to give this a color photo, or I'm not going to give this a color photo, or I'm going to put this on the front page, and I'm not. And I can't track that as much online. It's ever changing. So I'm interested in more of what is kind of like archival thing put out in the world. So I don't pay too much attention to online. And if I do, I read it in the paper later, right? And there's a good example. There's, I don't have the slide, but there's, and it may be counter narrative number 6, the pipeline protests. So online it says, pipeline protests disrupts lives and livelihoods. That's the online title. In the paper it says, Indian pipeline protests make for fearful, frustrated whites. I'm like, that's an interesting framework, right? And so that switched me, and I got it. There's SEO and like search engine I get it. But I don't think that title made the paper for a reason. I don't think that that's arbitrary. And so I lose track of that online, so I don't follow online media. Television is different, and I'm actually trying to figure out how to address television. Like, it's kind of loops of playing over. If you were in 2016 and you were constantly watching a video of someone being gunned down, or a family member giving this kind of morbid, press conferences where they kind of go up and like defend their dead kin. There's a clip that I have that I'm kind of trying to work with, but I'm not sure. There's a young kid named Paul O'Neill, 18. He was killed in Chicago. He was driving a Jaguar that he stole or something, and he gets out and he's running from the cops, and they shoot him in the back, I think. And his sister gives this press conference, and she says, I want you all to know that Paul had goals. And then she's sighing, and all you hear is camera flashes. It's like the weirdest thing to me, that kind of consumption. So I am interested in that. For television, right? But I haven't figured that out. But online news, if you read something, read it in the paper. That's what I would say. Just try to see if you can find what it looks like in the paper. I'll do two more. I guess it's a form of flattery. It's my project. I kind of feel like somebody will be like, look at what you did. I get asked this. Yeah.
Ways to look at the counter narrative. Would you feel comfortable seeing that in other places that weren't made by you?
I think if it were done and blown up in the street and I would be like, you stole my idea. But I want people to do this when they read, right? And I was approached about working in other papers, right? And for a time, I was getting like Seattle Times sent to me because they were like, hey, we want to do something site-specific, which I like. The New York Times is kind of everybody's paper. We're fine. These are national issues. And I wasn't comfortable with that because a big part of the project is about reading your paper reading more clearly. I'm not, the onus is on the Times, of course, way more, but it is also on the reader. And I didn't like this feeling that I was like looking for errors. And it's just not how I read. I'm not trying to catch somebody. I'm not trying to, and so I didn't do that. But I think for anybody reading whatever paper, you should approach it with a similar kind of process. But yeah, if somebody like decided to mark up the Chicago Sun-Times and then go paste it on the street, I'd be like, get your ass out of here. That's mine. Yeah. Hmm. But it's not a safe space, right? Yeah. Yeah. I get it. I think I don't want to rock the boat, right? I'm a black kid in a school that's like predominantly white, or an area that's predominantly white, and we kind of get along. So like, what's your beef? Why are you bringing this here? I think that's some of it. Because I don't know if I look at this and I go, oh, why are you exploiting black pain? I kind of feel like that's BS. I think that there are some of us who exist in spaces where we are very different and we're comfortable, or we're comfortable enough. Like, I'm just trying to get by. I don't need to roll out in the street and have to explain Michael Brown to someone, or have to confront this with people. And I mean, their responses vary, right? There's some places where I go and I hang it up and I see the black kids go like, they're like snapping. They're very in tune with what's there, and they feel like, okay, finally, I don't have to go to class with the explanation. I don't have to try to point it. I don't have to argue it. There's something that can speak for me. But I think a big part of what happened in Pomona is you have this small enclave, and people are like, we're chill. And I think that's a danger of liberal spaces. And I think that's why everybody's got whiplash now that we're like Trump. I'm like, you didn't see it. I mean, I see it. And I think at the time, people are like, oh, you're really sensitive. Like they're a Lebanese family. And I'm like, I don't actually think that's how they're using it. In fact, they said Tulsa man. That to me is like really offensive. And I think that it's, you use dog whistle a lot when we talk about Trump, but that's like a dog whistle to me. And it's othering. And that's dangerous and that's deadly. And when it comes time for us to kind of look and see these other people as valuable, we have all of these subtle, like these chips, we have all of these microaggressions, as people like to say, right? But it's dangerous as well because you can adopt that language and not feel like you're doing anything wrong or offensive. You can adopt those views. And so it's really important for me to make the connection between the demon and the demon, right? Is because the kind of things that pop up in the paper, I could sell that shit in the courtroom. Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that word. I'm familiar with that feeling. I know what that is because we've been so conditioned, And so I'm trying to figure out what kind of world are we in where like I can just put all these little black kids, I can put where they live in the paper, right? And as far as I'm concerned, the Central Park 5 have like another lawsuit they haven't filed yet because I'm like, it was like one kid from like, 119th and like West End. I was like, why is this here? Then he gave his school. So I think a lot of people don't want to have to face that in spaces where they feel like we're good. And I think when you're in an environment, like when I was at University of Chicago, you kind of just want to get out. I'm gonna, it's a great school in a lot of ways, but I think that you don't want to have to be bothered with that. It's exhausting. And it's not related to this, and I wish I had marked it. There's a really interesting passage in Citizen where this guy gets pulled over by the police. And he knows it's going to happen. He's a lawyer. He's like, I left my client's house, and I knew this was going to happen. I actually have my briefcase open on the passenger side, like so they can see that I'm a lawyer. And he's just talking about what it's like to not be able to like drive yourself sane, not to be able to kind of pull yourself out of that. And I feel like there are people who've managed to figured out how to survive some of these environments. But I think that's like a dangerous place to be. And so when we get to Trump and there are all these really clear examples. I'm like, the Times, you're kind of doing it too, you know? And I think the fallback is that the guy who wrote the Michael Brown article is black. And I'm like, but you put it in the paper, right? So I'm really interested in institution. Because what I found when I went to the Times, I was sitting at a table full of editors that were brown people. And the national editor is not white. And so I was like, why the white nationalist, like, you know, piece? That seems so chummy. And I think, you know, it's not about individuals. A lot of these people write articles and then they go and there's a photo attached to it and there's a headline attached to it and they don't make these decisions. But yeah, I think, you know, just to kind of get back to your question, I think it really is about comfort. And I don't know, I'm not interested in that comfort. But I think that also can be because I'm also a gay black woman. And so I see it's louder for me than maybe somebody who's like, oh, that's cool. That's like not that bad. Or, you know, it seems a little flawed, but not. And so I think we need to catch those moments. And so I think a lot of this happens in part, like whiteness is very invisible, just why I'm highlighting it. And I think that's a task that certain people and students in certain environments don't want. And I think my work kind of, because people think, oh, that's like reverse racism for you to put white, which is not a thing, so let's be clear. But that's part of it. So I think it's a big part of it. And that's why it's a challenging, I think, for certain campuses is that's a conversation I could just go to class and go home and eat and I graduate. I'm good to go. And now you can't. Yeah.
Guys, thank you for coming. We might, if you didn't feel like you could answer your question out loud, you might ask one or